This is U.S. History Regents Review, Unit 3, video number 2. We were talking about Reconstruction and how during this time period, the South was trying to physically rebuild and the country is trying to come together as a unified United States once more. And while African Americans at first, during Reconstruction, were given some rights, such as the right to vote, they actually end up losing all of these rights the second that Reconstruction ends. So again, black codes were created by local towns and cities to limit the freedom of freedmen by saying they had to have an employer. Otherwise, they could be arrested for being vagrants. They had to have permission to move about the town. All these really restrictive things. Sharecropping became the job that most African Americans had because they don't have other skills. Keep in mind, people who have been slaves their whole life don't have education. All they know how to do is farm. And many of them actually end up farming for the same person who used to own them. And the owners know they can take advantage of these people. So they force them to sign contracts agreeing to work in exchange for a portion of the crops. But then they'd say, oh, well, you don't have any equipment, so you will have to borrow it from me. You'll have to borrow the land from me. And they end up in these cycles of debt where it's not possible to escape it. And this is what most Black Americans do in the South for the next many decades, uh, well into like the 1940s, really. And this just keeps them in a cycle of poverty. Meanwhile, the southern states and districts are doing everything they can to take away the right to vote the 15th Amendment gave them. And they do these things because they can't directly take it away, they have to do these other kind of sneaky things, like poll taxes. A lot of Blacks are poor and they cannot afford a poll tax. A literacy test. This one was very tricky. Basically, they had to prove they could read, and not just read, but interpret legal documents. And it was set up to purposely confuse them and make sure that they fail. Grandfather clauses. If nothing else, certain states pass grandfather clauses where basically they had to prove that their grandfathers had voted in an election and then they'd be allowed to vote in an election, which of course, especially for the freedmen, was impossible. And if nothing else, if a Black person tried to show up at the polls to register to vote, groups like the Ku Klux Klan formed to terrorize Blacks, to make sure that they do not attempt to vote. They would wait around at the polling stations to beat anyone up who showed up, and also to terrorize Blacks who tried to create their own businesses and tried to advance in society and compete. This was a policy of racial terror to keep what they thought was to keep Blacks in their place and maintain white supremacy throughout the South for the following decades, up through the 1960s. So we're talking about 100 years of continued racial oppression after slavery ends. Jim Crow laws are created that legalize segregation, legal segregation, such as we'll see famously separate bathrooms, separate drinking fountains, separate sections in movie theaters and restaurants. And when some try to sue to say this is not legal, the courts actually say, no, it is. Plessy versus Ferguson, a very important court case, says that Blacks and whites can be separate as long as they are equal. This will eventually be overturned in the 1950s by Brown versus Board of Education. But for the next 50 years, the courts have said separate but equal is totally fine. So Black kids and white kids go to separate schools. And I think looking at this political cartoon is really important. We see a Black family. We see the KKK shaking hands with the White League. And the caption here, you might not be able to see, says worse than slavery. Now, how is that possible? Keep in mind, during slavery, Blacks had value to their white owners. They were an important piece of property that contributed to their economy, to the plantation. And so they would feed their slaves and try to take care of their basic well-being so that they could keep making money. But now that they don't have the same value anymore, they had no reason to value Black lives in any way. So racial terror, violence, killing an African American, these things were not really punished. And we will see this especially when we talk about lynching during the next unit. Now, while all of this is happening in the South, Westward Expansion is happening. And we've already talked a bit about Westward Expansion. Manifest destiny. This is a driving idea. It's that idea that it is God's will for the United States to expand all the way to the West Coast. It is our destiny. And at this point in American history, we pretty much own all the territory that goes that far, and now Americans just need to settle it. Here are two huge themes that go with our discussion of Westward Expansion. The first big theme that the Regents loves to ask about is that the federal government took an active role in promoting and funding westward expansion. The government wants this to happen, and we'll see that through a bunch of their policies. And the second big theme is that industrialization contributed to expansion and is directly connected to it. So the fact that there are huge factories going up and railroads being built and money being made in these northeastern cities, which we normally picture with industrialization, this is something that affects the entire country and promotes westward expansion and our changing economy. So, where does this start, the federal government support? It starts during the Civil War, which seems like a weird time to pass a bunch of laws. But actually, since the Southern Democrats had all left the Congress, it became really easy for Republicans in Congress to unite and pass a bunch of laws. So, three laws they passed helped develop the West. The first was the Pacific Railway Act, which gave funding to the Transcontinental Railroad. And this connected the country coast to coast. And here's a map of it. So, if you look at the red part, the Central Pacific Railway built this and worked their way east. And then the Union Pacific started in Omaha, Nebraska, and worked their way west. And then they met up right here. And when this railroad was completed, everything changed. Instead of taking weeks and weeks of a really dangerous journey to get from the East Coast to the West, now you could do it in a few days. This is revolutionary, and it ends here in California. So the coasts are connected. Huge. The Homestead Act gave free land to settlers who agreed to occupy and farm the land. So basically, if you, like this family here, were willing to go out west, settle in one spot and farm a bunch of acres, 160 acres for 5 years, you could get that land as a grant for free, aside from a small fee. So this really was appealing to a lot of people too. People went out and wanted to start their own homesteads. And the Moral Land Grant Act, you probably don't have to memorize this, but just know that this is another example of the federal government supporting westward expansion because they gave states and territories land, free land, to go found colleges, including like trade schools. But wait a minute, people already live here. There was a lot of conflict with American Indians. Remember, we've talked about Indians so far. We've talked about how there's always conflict wherever the frontier is. So wherever natives have been pushed furthest west, wherever that line is, there's conflict and violence. We've seen a bunch of broken treaties already. The Indian Removal Act of 1830 forced Indians to leave their territory in Georgia and some of those southern states, and they've been pushed further and further west. So now the conflict is going to reach the west because Americans want that land now. And we will see that there's even more violence.